The countryside is ingrained in the soul of the nation. The rolling fields, the hamlets and towns dotted through the landscape create for us the enduring vision of our island. But this enduring vision is completely unnatural. The countryside is as artificial as any city. It may look as if the landscape behind me is a product of nature, but it isn't. There's hardly a square mile of this island that hasn't been moulded by the hand of man. This is the story of how British ingenuity and design mastered nature. It's the story of how a spirit of improvement led to a countryside revolution that produced some of the most remarkable and unsung buildings in British history. The countryside has often been a formidable foe to its people. Since prehistoric times, we've been shaping the landscape around us. It's been built over again and again. Nature was a brooding menace that governed our lives. Harvests were at the whim of the weather. These fields are all that remain today of medieval methods of farming. I do find coming to a field like this, where there are substantial remains of the medieval agricultural system, completely exhilarating, because here before us in the landscape is concrete evidence of how our medieval ancestors actually grew their crops in a series of individual strips, each farmed by an individual family or a member of a family. And what happened in the 18th century was this whole strip system of farming was thrown away, transforming this to this. Miles and miles of land were patched together like a quilt. Across Britain, hedgerows and fences were constructed that systematically marked out new field boundaries. It was the most radical ever change in our island's landscape. In the 18th century, 80% of the land was owned by 5% of the population. A quarter of England was owned by just 300 of the aristocratic elite who gambled on the profitability of agriculture. This was a revolution that was stimulated by the gentry, and here at Sledmere, the transformation of the landscape owed everything to one man. Born in 1749, Christopher Sykes was MP for Beverley in Yorkshire. He married into the Kirby family that owned the Sledmere estate. Sykes proudly holds the permission from Parliament to turn Sledmere's medieval open fields into productive farmland. This incredibly ambitious project was planned right here in the library at Sledmere House.
This is a map that was drawn by Sir Christopher Sykes himself, ready to set the scene for his transformation of this landscape. About 1776, he was planning to create a whole new landscape, but in order to do that, he had to clear away the village which lay just near the house. He kept a notebook, or his diaries. Here, Dunn gave the tenants at Sledmere notice to quit, October the 2nd, 1777, and that was the first stage of clearing the village away.
So I'm assuming that these are just the outlines of the hedges?
Yes, I'm sure they are, because the main impetus for enclosure was to get a larger area of arable, much more corn crop being grown. And in order to do this, it meant transforming what had just been sheep walk and laying out hedged fields. There'd really been no hedges, no trees before enclosure. It was a very bleak landscape.
Enclosure was a gamble that paid dividends. In his lifetime, Sykes saw the value of his estate double. From here, the scale of the enterprise is clear. This just seems like the English countryside, but it's very difficult to realise that it is really an artificial creation. It's designed, isn't it?
Indeed. I mean, there was nothing here 250 years ago. It was a very just open landscape, bleak, no hedges, no trees. There hadn't been trees here since probably prehistoric times.
And the Sledmere estate was, what, sort of 30,000 acres or something? And that's just one little patch of England that's being enclosed. And this was actually happening all over the place.
Yes, it was happening over the great swathe of the middle of England, through Lincolnshire up into Yorkshire. This period, in the late 18th through to the mid-19th century, whole swathes of England were being transformed.
In the 40 years from 1760, 3 million acres of England, Scotland and Wales were transformed. At a time when yields per acre in France were actually dropping, in Britain, corn production was up by 40%. British technological innovations like the threshing machine and Jethro Tull's seed drill mechanised farming, and experiments in field rotation produced more crops. Britain became the granary of Europe, and at the centre of this industrious landscape emerged a whole new set of buildings, the model farms, which fascinated people from all over the world. This is Life Hill Farm on the Sledmere estate in the East Riding of Yorkshire. And here you can see exactly what's meant by a model farm. Behind me is the farmhouse, but joined onto it and incredibly carefully planned and arranged are all the buildings that you'd need. So there are the barns, the dairy, the granary, the cart house, everything, in fact, that you would need to create a really successful farming corporation. Over 300 model farms were built on estates across Britain. They were so called because they set out a model way of living. At Sledmere, Christopher Sykes designed the farms himself. He was inspired and influenced by Andrea Palladio, the Italian Renaissance architect most admired by the 18th century rich. These are restrained classical designs based on the 16th century villa farmsteads found around Venice. But it wasn't just the gentry who lived here. The tenant farmers were even more ambitious. They were determined to embrace the new style of agriculture and were about to become Britain's first rural middle class. It was progress and profit that shaped the Georgian landscape. This was a period when Britain's buildings served the needs of agriculture and when architecture in the countryside reached new heights. Improvement was the buzzword of the 18th century, and driving investment in it were the ruling classes of Britain. Even the king, George III, was lampooned as Farmer George. He'd made farming fashionable by building 3 model farms at Windsor Castle. I'm at Hokum Hall in Norfolk to investigate the showpiece estate of the century. It was at places like Hokum, owned by Thomas Cook, that the aristocratic elite invested in agriculture on an unprecedented scale. Cook of Norfolk was an incredibly successful businessman. And at the heart of his success lay the fact that he was a brilliant self-publicist. He was a sort of early version of Richard Branson. And much of this great success centred on a series of very original and exciting new buildings. And the biggest of those was the Great Barn. This is a barn, but it's a barn with a difference. I mean, it's a piece of architecture. It's almost, you could almost call it flamboyant.
Well, it's a flamboyant building built by a flamboyant man. Thomas William Cook was a sort of larger-than-life character. By the time he died, at the age of 88, he was almost a father and the god of agriculture to his tenant farmers and Norfolk people. And this really reflects that side of his personality.
And the brickwork is really superb, isn't it? You've got this moulded brick pediment here, and then running around the whole building there's this cornice with, I suppose you'd call it a modillion cornice, with these little pieces sticking out, and it's all done in moulded brick. And I'm assuming that the whole lot was dug out of the earth on the estate.
Yes, indeed. There were large brick kilns on the estate which were making this yellow brick, especially for estate buildings.
So very carefully laid out, very self-conscious in the middle of the estate.
Yes.
It was a classical temple to agriculture, built and built to last. As well as being a grand architectural statement, Hokum was the setting for the most important agricultural gatherings of the 18th century. The estate became incredibly well known. I mean, it was a sort of a wonder of the world, wasn't it?
Yes, it was somewhere where everybody had to come. The sheep shearings, which probably began in 1776 and became sort of bigger and bigger and grander, so that everyone who was anyone from Europe and America and all over Britain had to be seen here.
But it does seem pretty extraordinary to our eyes that people would come to a sheep shearing. I mean, it's just sort of, you know, what is it, one thing that you can imagine you don't want to go and watch, a sheep shearing? You know, why was it that it was so famous?
Farming was fashionable.
So what did happen on these amazing occasions?
There could be as many as 700 of them, all on their horses, all following Cook around his estate, looking at the farms, looking at the crops. It wasn't just sheep shearing. It was really the forerunner of agricultural shows today.
In just 15 years, Cook quadrupled the value of his estate, from £5,000 to £20,000 a year. In fact, in the 18th century, there was a renaissance in barn building. This is the Great Barn at Wimpole Home Farm in Cambridgeshire. It was designed in 1794 by England's most famous architect, Sir John Soane, who 6 years earlier had begun to design the Bank of England. The popularity of aristocrats going on the European Grand Tour fed an obsession with Italian art. So many landscape paintings were collected by the British that it was said that there were more here than there were in Italy. This was largely due to the fashion for painters like Claude Lorraine, a collection of which Thomas Cook bought and brought here to Hokum Hall. The subject of mythical figures and classical buildings had been the standard for centuries. But Lorraine's composition had what we would call a picturesque landscape as the dominating feature, preferably with a sentimental rustic scenario in the foreground. It was paintings like this by Claude Lorraine that inspired the English aristocracy to remodel the landscapes around their estates. The pioneer of this sort of landscape gardening was a man called Capability Brown. His first commission was in Croom Park in Worcestershire, and Jane Owen has been there to see how he created a revolution in English landscape design.
I've never sat in an 18th century oil painting before. It's rather lovely, but the point about this is it shows elegantly that landscape is our great forgotten art form. Lancelot Brown earned his nickname because he persuaded his clients of the capabilities of their grounds. On the continent, the formal style still dominated, but in Britain, Brown was one of the landscapers who swept away formality in favour of a more natural look. Croom was his first solo commission, and it shows the beginnings of Brown's genius in layout, composition and design. This is a late 18th century map of Croom. It is a sort of Disneyland. There's so much going on, lots to do, and lots to see too. I mean, over here you have the menagerie, and we haven't got the full list of what was in there, but there were certainly flying squirrels, all sorts of exotic birds, including oriental pheasants and so on. And over here in this huge kitchen garden, you'd have had lots of exotics, melons and pineapples, all those sorts of things, very exotic blooms too, to show off to your neighbours and friends when they came to visit. So much going on and so much non-English stuff in this very English landscape. Capability Brown's themed landscapes included delightful hidden novelties. Walking on water, entertainment 18th century style. Just imagine this. You're staying at Croom back in the 18th century and your host invites you on a carriage ride. Pile into the carriage, it thunders down this huge river, quote unquote, and suddenly your driver hangs a left into this huge river. Terror, adrenaline. It's fine. You can't see it, but there's a little carriage drive underneath this river. This is Park Seat. It's a place to rest, an eye-catcher in itself, and a place to take in the view. And from here I can see the rotunda, the church, the house itself, which is an eye-catcher, the temple greenhouse, the grotto, the ruins behind, and then the panorama tower. Architecture is just as important as natural features in these great landscapes. So here we are in Capability's emerging shrubbery, and judging by this curving path, are we about to be surprised?
Well, that's correct, because all these curving paths, they open up to a series of surprises, and as you say, we're about to come to a surprise. This is the temple greenhouse.
If I may say so, it's rather large, and it doesn't appear to have any glass.
Well, it is very big, yes, but there were a lot of plants because they were being collected from all over the world. And in the winter, they put huge glass frames in between the columns on the back and fixed them at the back. So it was completely enclosed in glass on the front, and then it was opened up in the summer.
It's so contradictory, isn't it? Because here we are in a sort of what people think of as a quintessentially English landscape, but actually it's made up with lots of foreign plants, foreign ideas, and actually foreign architecture.
Well, that's true, but the landscape was an invention of the English, so that at the same time as the greenhouse was being built, the natural, in inverted commas, landscape was being created.
So in other words, this is the ultimate natural, unnatural landscape.
Yes, that's right, and the first of its kind.
In all, Brown created over 150 landscapes, and the pinnacle of his achievement is here at Blenheim in Oxfordshire. Brown worked here for 10 years. It was 20 years since he'd started his solo career at Croom. He was in his late 40s and at the peak of his powers. His confidence soared. The lake is a quiet contrast to the eye-catching bridge and the house designed by Vanbrugh, but the lake isn't a natural feature. Brown built it. He was an awesomely ambitious engineer. Brown tapped water from one river, the Glyn, on the east of the estate, channeled it into another, the Evenwest, and the lake between took a year to fill. Brown declared proudly, "The Thames will never forgive me." Brown was a master of water manipulation. He did it with great skill at Croom and here at Blenheim, and you can really see how far he's come. This is the Grand Cascade. It's very beautiful. It's also practical. It's a dam. But what was the result of all this labour? What has Brown really left us with? Brown's genius was that he conjured up landscapes of the imagination, landscapes buried deep in the British psyche. He did it so brilliantly that by the 20th century, people had forgotten that. So they'd visit landscapes like this and just think, how beautiful, isn't Mother Nature brilliant? And it's just in the last few years there's been so much restoration work and research into Brown that we've begun to reappreciate him and reevaluate him. I think Brown's landscapes touch the British soul.
In the 18th century, there was a revolution in how we saw the countryside around us. The aristocracy had tamed the land for agriculture and recreation. But there was also the great outdoors, once considered dreary and wild, that now people began to find beautiful. Places like the Lake District. As the end of the century approached, attitudes to nature underwent another shift. For one man, affection developed into a lifelong passion. In 1798, the poet William Wordsworth turned his back on mainstream society and moved to a tiny house in a tiny hamlet in the village of Grasmere. Stephen Parisian is at Dove Cottage in search of how the Romantics spearheaded a very modern pursuit.
Anybody who was anybody, poets, painters, politicians, came here to visit Wordsworth and his family. It was here that Wordsworth wrote his most famous poem, commonly known as Daffodils, and it was from here that Wordsworth inspired a generation of countryside enthusiasts. Dove Cottage was a simple structure deeply rooted in the rural culture that for Wordsworth was everything. The house was much more than a place to live for his family. It was intended as a dream, a home as a personal paradise. He said it was a life of plain living and high thinking. And it was the laboratory for some of the most famous Romantic poetry. Having nature on his doorstep was so essential that Wordsworth had this wall knocked through. He would then not have to be distracted by the rest of the house to reach his beloved garden. This was a haven for Wordsworth where the poet would pace around, composing his thoughts. Keith, what does Dove Cottage and its environment mean to Wordsworth?
I think it stands for the harmony of man and nature, the human habitation in the natural landscape. And I think that Dove Cottage was a coming back, as it were, to the bosom of nature, to that natural experience that they'd come home to reinvest in.
Wordsworth then is very much eulogising the country cottage as the ideal building type. Is that something you think that he's bequeathed to subsequent generations?
Yes, I think he probably has. I mean, it was taken up by later architectural writers and very much developed as the national kind of building, if you like, that represented the soul of the nation and made it, again, exemplary of a national and particularly British kind of building.
Nothing sold this idea more strongly than what was then Wordsworth's best-selling book. Surprisingly, it was not his poetry. With his guide to the Lake District, though, surely Wordsworth was inviting mass tourism.
Well, ironically, you're right that he did contribute to the development of the tourist industry and to come and look at the places that he'd written his poetry. But he was discriminating. I mean, he wanted people to have the same kind of experience which he had enjoyed himself. What he did not want was them to destroy the very thing which he wanted them to have access to.
But what was the Romantics' legacy? For me, Wordsworth is responsible for bringing a new appreciation of nature to the reading public. And I think it was here that the British love affair with the countryside really began.
During the 18th century, our relationship with the landscape fundamentally altered. But this wasn't just about poetry. It was also about hard economics. The price of wheat, and therefore the price of bread, was cheaper in 1750 than it was 50 years earlier. The countryside revolution was growing and was about to transform our market towns. The buildings of the countryside revolution dominated the 18th century landscape. Across Britain, attitudes to nature changed radically. Increased agricultural production boosted the growth of the market town. Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk holds one of the most successful traditional street markets in the country today. With over 1,600 feet of stall fronts, it looks much as it would have done 250 years ago. At the weekend, the town comes to life.
The 18th century was the boom time for the market town. In fact, market towns became the characteristic urban settlement of Georgian Britain. There were more than 1,000 of them, but only 20 had a population of more than 5,000 people. It was where the town met the countryside, and the meeting place was right here in the market.
In 1750, the rural population of Britain was 3 times larger than the urban. It was the countryside that provided the food to supply Britain's expanding towns. Markets provided the growing population with their weekly shop, and in turn, the town built up around the market. This is the market cross, where the traders would pay their dues and where the everyday disputes of the market were managed. But this building wasn't just built by anyone. In 1779, the commission was won by one of Britain's leading architects, the Scotsman Robert Adam. The cross's exceptional design reflected the central significance of the market to the town. Riding the wave of success were those facilitating trade, the emerging mercantile middle class. A good example of their increasing fortunes can be found in the nearby market town of King's Lynn. The Trinity Guildhall was the home of a merchants' guild. Here they built an exquisite symbol of their newfound affluence.
This is a 15th century Guildhall. It became the town hall in the mid-16th century with the dissolution of the guilds. By the 18th century, by the 1720s, being used as an assembly room as roads improved, but that was all to quicken later in the century as the economy and society of East Anglia expanded. But there were assemblies here, obviously not big enough, not enough space, improved turnpikes, more people, more things to do, more marriages to be made, more business to be done. All over East Anglia you have assembly rooms being built.
And this room, it had a very specific function, didn't it?
Yes, and to bring together the merchants of the town and the gentry and aristocracy of this part of East Anglia together. One of the reasons being, as society was expanding, they used to meet in the town halls. The town halls were too small. They wanted bigger spaces. They wanted spaces which were more a la mode, up to date, the latest fashion. The colours you see here are the colours we got in 1998. We went back. This is the original colour scheme of 1767. The mirrors are not 18th century, they're mid-19th century. But of course there would have been mirrors all the way around, because as they danced and so on, they liked to have everything reflected. They liked to have the chandeliers reflected. So mirrors played a very important part. You couldn't do this. The old town halls were rather dark, perhaps too small. So yes, this is a step up. Assemblies are not new, but these kinds of assembly rooms are new, and so bigger, more splendid gatherings.
So the reason that these sorts of rooms burgeoned is because these market towns fundamentally changed in character.
Well, the towns were, in the course of the 18th century, towns became more important. And the gentry and aristocracy of East Anglia wanted to be seen in towns. The merchants of towns were trading with the continent. They were very, very rich people. The status of merchants, urban merchants, was increasing. So towns were becoming more important. You can see this in their architecture, how they were transformed by classical architecture. This is very much a classical room. You can see in the prospects they had made, Lynn from the west, or Norwich from the east. You can see people were now being in a town, and being a merchant prince in a town had a greater status by the end of the 18th century than earlier. And hence, I suppose, the demand for bigger, better places like this, assembly rooms, because although they worked hard, they also played hard, because when they had their parties in here, they did drink a lot.
Yeah, and as important was the fact that the aristocracy were now leaving their country houses and they were coming into town for their social life.
They are. They're coming into town to play. And of course, there are marriages between the merchants of Lynn, the daughters of the merchants of Lynn. Like Samuel Brown had 2 daughters who married. He died in 1784. And 2 local landed gentlemen snapped up both daughters and took fortunes into those landed families. So there's lots and lots of money in towns now. They're bigger, they're richer, and many landed families have their eyes on suitable marriages, of course.
A place like Lynn began to acquire a completely different character during the 18th century.
It did, and I think that was helped because the whole economy was picking up from the 1760s. You wanted people to come into the town and spend money. The corporation made money. The hairdressers, the fan makers and hairdressers in the streets nearby, the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, all made lots of money the more activity there was on this upper-class leisure scene. Gentry wanted to meet merchants, merchants wanted to meet gentry, but they wanted a swish environment.
The market town had become an integral part of aristocratic life. These trading centres now became central to the political, social and economic structure of Britain. The first Earl of Bristol, who lived just 6 miles away, built the manor house in Bury St Edmunds so that he could enjoy all the benefits of his local market town. Class and culture combined to create the beginnings of modern society, and trade was the sphere around which it revolved. Fixed prominently on the walls of King's Lynn's customs house were the twin symbols of the town's export, corn, and its import, wine. At the heart of Lynn's prosperity was the wine trade. The merchants of Lynn had a series of networks that went all across Europe, bringing thousands of gallons of wine into the town every year. This trade made a small number of families extremely rich. So how did they spend their money? Well, the answer was on building, of course. This was the home of wine merchant Samuel Taylor. Framing the main entrance were expensive and showy Baroque columns. His requirements as a merchant prince included ostentatious displays of wealth, but most of all, this house was about function, and that meant size. Ranging from the house all the way down to the waterfront were huge warehouses where barrels of wine were stored. To one side of the main entrance is the counting house, Samuel Taylor's very own private bank. Should they be able to afford his high interest rates, Taylor lent money to smaller traders. And it was the few families of the rich merchants who created employment and even paid for the construction of civic buildings. This was an awful lot more than just a very grand residence. It was actually the headquarters of an international business. Here, under one roof, you had warehousing, distribution, a showroom, even an office for the accountants. It was merchants like Samuel Taylor of Clifton House who were the men who really ran King's Lynn. In the 18th century, Britain's international trade flourished, but also trade became a truly nationwide enterprise for the first time. Market towns like this were able to prosper because Georgian Britain acquired a new transport network, the turnpike roads. Ed McCann has been on the road to find out how this new phenomenon knitted Britain together.
During the 18th century, Britain's landscape was fundamentally changed by the construction of roads from one end of the country to the other. Engineers like Telford and Macadam developed the technology of road construction so that it was cost-effective and easy to do. And this enabled them to absolutely alter the landscape and link towns together.
After the Romans left, Britain's roads degraded into rain-soaked dirt tracks. 18th century engineers changed all that. They developed a system of road construction using crushed angular stone, placed in layers and heavily compacted to increase the amount of interlocking of the surface and hence the strength. The roads were gently cambered and had side ditches to help them drain effectively. In fact, modern road construction owes a lot to the thinking and invention of the 18th century engineers. But how were these new roads to be paid for? British entrepreneurial spirit went into overdrive. private companies bought up stretches of existing road, installed gates across them called turnpikes, and charged travellers for the privilege of using them. As you can imagine, this was somewhat less than popular.
In the Bristol region in 1749, there's a tremendous series of attacks on turnpikes. The interesting things about it, actually, is that these are not industrial workers. You know, these are countrymen, and they advance on the turnpikes in July of 1749, smash up a turnpike at near Long Ashton and Bedminster, and then decide, well, there's no opposition. Heartened by that, they think, what should we do next? So they head up to the top of Totterdown and attack another turnpike successfully. But at this point, are set upon by a large number of mercenary sailors who've been brought out as a sort of a bunch of special constables, I suppose, for the nearest analogy, by the Mayor of Bristol, and told to just go out and deal with these characters. They certainly attacked them with great violence, and one farmer who was eventually arrested and taken to Bristol Newgate Jail died in jail of the head wounds he received from a sabre. So these guys were armed seriously and pretty dangerous. Yeah, absolutely. So they managed to arrest 30 of these poor guys and drag them back to Newgate Jail in Bristol, where they awaited trial. And interestingly enough, although it's a capital offence, only 2 were hanged. So actually bringing cases against turnpike rioters wasn't the easiest thing in the world. There was a huge amount of sort of customary sense of legitimacy about, it was a fair grievance.
By the end of the 18th century, there were around 8,000 turnpike gates across our roads. And alongside the turnpike gates came buildings peculiar to Britain, toll houses. Toll houses often have a distinctive polygonal shape with lots of windows. This was so that the toll collector could see traffic coming from any direction. Mostly used as private residences today, toll houses can still be found clinging to the sides of Britain's A roads. Better roads, of course, meant more traffic, and that opened up business opportunities for new towns.
This road is Watling Street, which in the 18th century was like the M1. It connected London to the north of England. And this town, Stony Stratford, is full of coaching inns, which made it a kind of service station of the day. On which subject we're about to go off and fuel up the horses. So lead on.
In this small town alone, there were more than a dozen coaching inns, all vying for the fast-moving business. Stagecoaches were so called because they travelled in stages between the coaching inns. And in Stony Stratford, 40 a day barrelled through.
How significant is this road to Britain at the time?
This road would have been the fastest road in Europe in its day.
How fast is fast?
A fast toll road would be up to 10 miles an hour, and certainly 8 miles an hour would be a good average on a turnpike. And that's much faster than anything before. Before turnpikes and stagecoaches, it would have taken you 2 whole days to get from London to Oxford, whereas once the stagecoach comes along, it would have taken you 6 hours, which is a lot less than 2 days. That's the equivalent of replacing the boat with the aeroplane across the Atlantic. People travel as they've never travelled before, and that's particularly true in winter. Travelling in winter before good modern roads was almost impossible.
Road travel was notoriously dangerous. As well as the potential for being thrown out of a high-speed carriage, there was no heating, and more than once the driver arrived only to find a passenger frozen to death. But the perils were worth it, and the economy never looked back.
It changes the position of farmers, because whereas previously they'd have had to sell their grain and their produce on their doorstep, now they can go to the nearest market town, where they're likely to get a better price, certainly a fairer price. So this is an era in which Britain becomes a nation-state in many ways, and the turnpike is an important part of that. It allows national newspapers, they can be distributed around the country, they have a network of correspondence. It allows London to be in contact with Ireland and Edinburgh. It reduces the autonomy of different parts of Britain, and that's part of what it means to be a modern nation.
In just over 100 years, there were over 1,000 turnpike trusts, controlling 25,000 miles of British roadways. Thanks to a small advance in engineering technology, Britain became a truly mobile society.
18th century Britain was being transformed. The countryside economy was enjoying an incredible boom, stimulating the creation of a new breed of remarkable and unique buildings. The countryside revolution of the 18th century generated a spirit of dynamism in Britain's market towns, and one responded with particular energy.
On the 1st of January 1779, with the cry of "God save King George," this remarkable building opened to the public. This wasn't a royal building, it wasn't even an aristocratic building. It was a vast shopping centre. The Peace Hall in Halifax was the place where people came to sell woolen cloth. It was the place where the town and the countryside met.
Peace Hall was the architectural expression of this town's confidence in its economy. It once housed over 300 shops, around a courtyard bigger than 2 football pitches.
This extraordinary building is very closely modelled on ancient Roman examples. In fact, it's really based on an ancient Roman forum, that's to say, a marketplace. But of course, this isn't in ancient Rome, it's not even in Italy. This is in West Yorkshire, and that, I think, requires some explanation.
Agricultural labourers in the hills above Halifax fashioned their sheep's wool into a length of cloth called a piece, from where the hall gets its name. Then once a week, they would load their carts and set off for market. In 1775, local architect Thomas Bradley was entrusted with the design of a new market building. He argued for the principles of Roman classical architecture, but adapted it for much more modern commercial circumstances. 4 years and £8,500 later, the Peace Hall was the striking result.
This is an incredibly grand building. It must have been very expensive to build. I mean, how was it financed?
Well, it was a very, very rich industry. I mean, Defoe talks about the Leeds market, where up to £20,000 would change hands in a single market, which in those days was a huge sum. So the clothiers were extremely wealthy.
So what actually happened here when the traders all assembled?
Well, the bell would be rung just before 10. At that point, everybody, all the merchants would flood in. And originally there was only the north gate was the only way in, so it was very narrow and congested. And then they would spread out and they would go along the galleries and they would visit each shop and they would go in and look at the cloth and they would do their business.
I mean, in a way, this is the sort of key building that links the countryside with the town. I mean, you can't have the town without people coming in here from the countryside, and you can't have the countryside without the economic effort that's generated in the town.
Exactly.
And this is where the exchange takes place and why the town presumably was important.
Well, that's right. Halifax's great days as a clothier town came in the 16th century, but it was still very, very important in the 18th century, and they were trying to keep its importance going by actually building this.
For 6 days of the week, the hall was used to stockpile Halifax's most precious commodity, wool.
Walking around the outside of the Peace Hall, it actually looks like a prison. I mean, this wall is incredibly tall, isn't it?
Well, it was in a way. It was built like a fortress without any windows on the outside to make sure that nobody could get in and steal anything, because the pieces of cloth were extremely valuable. And Halifax had to have its own law, and it actually built its own gibbet, which looks like a very kind of primitive form of guillotine. And if you were caught stealing cloth, because it was such a serious problem, you could have your head cut off.
Cloth made in cottage industries in the hills of Yorkshire and sold at the Peace Hall was exported as far afield as Persia, modern-day Iran. And, of course, it provided Britain with the material for drapery, clothes and upholstery. The cloth trade made many millionaires. One manufacturer, Samuel Hill, employed hundreds of cloth makers across the region in a great pre-industrial business. But the Peace Hall was not the only cloth hall in Britain. The Yorkshire Hills accommodated other monumental market buildings, each with their own unique floor plan. Leeds Mixed Cloth Hall, Huddersfield, Bradford Peace Hall, Leeds White Cloth Hall and Wakefield. But all have since gone the way of the bulldozer, except the hall at Halifax. The Peace Hall is the most spectacular expression of the success of the pre-industrial town and its reliance on the produce of the countryside for its wealth.
The great structures of the Industrial Revolution are very well known. But buildings such as this, produced by the Agricultural Revolution, are often overlooked. I think that this is as great as any of the great Victorian monuments and is a structure that certainly ought to be much better known.
Just decades after the construction of the Peace Hall, market towns like Halifax went into almost terminal decline. The countryside revolution had fed and clothed Britain in a way that had seemed impossible only a century before. The 18th century landscape produced new architecture that was classical in style and aspiration. But more importantly, it saw the happy marriage of town and country in a mutually beneficial economic, artistic and social union. This provided the people, the capital and the know-how for the Industrial Revolution. Next time, I'll discover how the new buildings of the Industrial Revolution invented work as we know it. And how they didn't just shape Britain, they shaped the world.